if you could tell us a little bit about your thoughts on the relationship between the president in the United States and the whole deep state apparatus.
Okay, yeah, I've talked to you about his base, and
Hi, please continue. Yeah.
okay, okay. That there is the financial hegemony is becoming more and more important. The fiscal position of the United States is literally on the brink, and the debt situation is becoming really very close to a problem, and he's contributed to it. He has a huge sort of bubble in the market, this tech bubble, this AI tech bubble in the market, which is hugely overvalued, and is showing signs of now that it may be close to some form of deflation. So this is also a preoccupation of all of those, if you like, separate factors you mentioned. I think he has a little bit more room because I think what I called earlier the deep state is divided somewhat on this. On the one hand are the China hawks, and the China hawks believe very strongly. They've been shocked at how quickly China is growing economically and in terms of its tech abilities. And they see it has been going up, but they also believe it's about to become exponential. It's just getting to the point of an exponential liftoff. And at that point, then, there's not much America will be able to do about it. It will have lost its primacy. It will have lost its, if you like, hegemony. And therefore, they are wanting, and they're quite urgently saying, look, we don't have the wherewithal. We don't have the military equipment. There's no inventory of military weapons to really do more than one, to focus on one conflict. And in Ukraine, you've already lost the war. So, yeah, of course, Kellogg will go on the television and Jack Keane and say, oh, no. Russia's weak, it's losing. But, many of them don't believe that. They can see that Russia is winning and they've lost the war. So they're saying, come on, we need to pivot out of Ukraine, find a solution, get out. Now, I don't know if this is the factor. I mean, I just don't know whether, because I don't know what and who says this to Trump, but undoubtedly there are people there that are very likely saying this to him. And they're also saying, you've got to focus on disrupting the BRICS financially. You've got all that. That's important to do, to try and destroy that, because the financial structure, I mean, we are in a strange world where the tariffs, the shock and awe tariffs attempt, I mean, has had a blowback. It hasn't worked. It's not working for him. I mean, he can say that there'll be more, the tariffs coming in, more money on tariffs. But reality is that only some of that will be new money. A lot of that will be actually Americans having to pay the new higher prices for goods that are paying the tariffs. So it's not working. And we've seen that. I mean, you're sitting in India, so you've seen particularly how that has had a sort of negative reaction.
Also, the impact on the bond yield is important.
And on the bond market is particularly delicate. Yes, the bond market is highly delicate because there has been the less readiness to buy treasuries. So they've developed this artificial way of boosting the treasury to try and enable a reduction of interest rates. This is the stable coins, the meme coins, the Ether, the even Bitcoin. All of these things. The stable coin particularly has been, Besant and others have been so excited by it because you see, all of these people are getting a digital currency that, gives them freedom as it, and that at the same time, with the digital currency, they use that to buy treasuries. The owners of the coin keep as sort of some sort of collateral awards of US Treasuries stocks, and
These are
therefore it's
these are more
creating a demand for it.
these are more financial assets than digital currency. In fact, the word digital currency is kind of misleading because people think that this is an alternative to currency in exchange. But what we are seeing is these are becoming huge financial assets that is also pushing up dollars to the extent they need it, pushing up dollars importance because all these are then pegged back into the dollar system.
Well, it has two other ramifications. One is this is an unregulated issuance of money, whatever you want to call it. But I mean, even if it's tokenized money, it is, creating and putting into the US money, which is likely to increase inflation in the longer run when we've seen that. But the other point I would say is, quite clearly you can see with these tokens and these stable coins, I mean, really they're sort of a form of Ponzi scheme, because, the people come in and they put up real $1 for each token, and the people who manage them take that, and then they take the interest from buying treasuries. But what happens if there's a market crash or something like this, and people start getting scared and say, "Can we have our dollars back, please?" This is the typical thing that happens. Ponzi scheme. Suddenly, everyone says, "Well, are we sure this is really safe? Is this really safe?" And then suddenly, there's a huge redemption of these tokens for cash, and then they have to go into the market, the debt market, and start selling bonds and treasuries. Then liquidity disappears, and you have a big financial crisis in your hands. So, I mean, this is the other dimension. It's not quite the same sort of dimension we talked earlier, but it's a very pressing and a very urgent one because for Trump, the economic situation, I think, is his first priority above, the foreign policy issues, equal perhaps only by Israel.
So the fragility of the financial system is what you were talking about.
I am saying the whole financial system, the whole financialized structure of the United States is highly unstable. And that is the thing. And so with the financialization, you've had the steady erosion of the real economy in America, and it has become a financialized one. And now that's become an overwhelming element. And it's like a sort of inverted pyramid, upside down pyramid, sitting on a tiny base of real value, whether it's gold or oil or whatever commodity. There's very little to underpin it. So were there to come a point when everyone wants to get out of this big pyramid, there's only a tiny base with which to finally support the value of what people presume is their assets. So these things are all, I know I spent a bit of time on this, but because they tend to get ignored when, the strategists and they see it in these sort of, oh, well, now Trump has, changed his view, but has he really changed his view? Perhaps it's all a trick that he's playing on Russia. It's really something very much more complicated. I see these commentaries that come out that say, oh, well, he's cleverly trying to sort of trap Putin and others. I mean, Trump can change his mind tomorrow and do something else. Of course, I mean, he's whimsical. But what I'm saying is that I think a really important thing on him is how do I get out from some of these pressures that are on me because it's driving him nuts. very, very frustrated by all these pressures. So I think he is trying to do that. And in a way, I mean, he can present us as saying, well, look, look, Putin forces the Europeans to accept reality. What's wrong with that? And that enables us then to sort of, clear the decks for China and tell the deep state that. Of course, the die-hard Russophobe will never change. They will go on saying the only thing we must have the defeat of Russia because, everything, Europeans particularly, have so much, they have so heavily invested in Ukraine, that, I mean, for them, you know, to see a defeat, as they would put it, of Ukraine is so intolerable because it would bring down the whole project. The house would come down with it. It would just bring down the house. So they just, they can't envisage that.
Well, I think I agree with Alastair in part. That is to say, the meeting in Anchorage was partly performative. It was an effort to change the subject. It was an effort to divert attention from Trump's basic failure to accomplish what he promised his supporters he would do. In fact, in many ways, he's done the opposite of what he promised on not just on foreign policy, but on other matters. And of course, he must be aware that notwithstanding his adherence to the Peter Navarro School of Economics, which, as far as I can tell, has about one member other than President Trump, that is Peter Navarro himself, um, I think he must be aware that we're about to face a surge of inflation from the tariffs, which are finally going into effect. The effects have been masked. And I note also that the chairman of the Federal Reserve, Powell, at Jackson Hole, Wyoming, in a meeting with central bankers yesterday, Friday, described his position on changing interest rates as open-minded, but he noted that he excused his inability to say whether he would lower or raise interest rates by saying that the United States now had a contracting labor market. That is to say, the number of people employed was going down. Many of them dropped out so they've exited the employment market. That keeps the nominal unemployment rate low. But this is characteristic of a recession. It is a slowing of growth or the reversal of growth in the economy. And he said that, of course, offsets inflation. So on the one hand, we have inflation. On the other hand, we have declining economic growth. That is the textbook definition of stagflation,
Right.
which is not a good thing. It is not a good thing. So I think President Trump faces multiple difficulties. And his characteristic response to these things, as I said, is to do something, put the troops on the streets in Washington, D.C., go to Anchorage and welcome President Putin and so forth. But there's more to this than that. He has an ambition to get the Nobel Peace Prize. You and I and others may consider that to be forlorn hope, but he apparently does take that prospect seriously. He's even called the Norwegian government.
I mean, Obama bombed Afghanistan and destroyed Libya, and he got a Nobel Prize. So you never know.
Well, exactly. The Nobel Peace Prize was greatly devalued by its award to President Obama, who was a very decent fellow, I think, but he got it basically for being of mixed race and not for anything else. He seemed to people in Norway to represent a real sea change in American politics. Perhaps he did. Anyway, they couldn't think of any other way to get him to Oslo, so they gave him a prize so he would come. Anyway, I want to say that I think that Trump's motives are multiple. He does really want to produce a peace in Ukraine. I don't think he cares much about Ukrainians. And I don't think he had, until he went to Anchorage, I don't think he had any grasp at all of the issues at stake in Europe. He went and he did something very important. He listened directly to Vladimir Putin. Not only that, he greeted Vladimir Putin as an equal. I mean, you could not have a more stark contrast than that between his greeting of Putin in Anchorage and his impersonating the headmaster at a school with a bunch of recalcitrant students with the 7 European dwarves who came to the Oval Office to be chastised and bamboozled by the great master, President Trump. So he's been criticized for conferring equality on President Putin. I think that was exactly the right thing to do. It opens the door to peace. It does not create a peace process. And it's clear that there is some confusion coming out of that meeting, as there always is in meetings with Trump. Since he doesn't prepare, he has no clear fixed objective. What happened is always a matter of dispute. So he did persuade Vladimir Putin to agree to meet with President Volodymyr Zelensky, which President Putin had earlier declined to do. However, of course, President Putin will not go to such a meeting unless there is an agenda that has been set by careful work at the lower levels. Summits are generally for ratification of decisions that have been worked out at lower levels under the guidance of the leaders. They are not for a negotiation from ab initio. And yet, that is exactly what President Trump did in Anchorage. So we come out of that. He also apparently misunderstood the Russian reference to security guarantees. Russia needs security guarantees. In effect, it started this war because it couldn't get security guarantees. It was constantly being menaced by the enlargement of the NATO presence in Ukraine and the possible membership of Ukraine in NATO. And I think actually one of the most interesting things to me, telling things, is the current discussion of security guarantees, which seems to be entirely military and entirely unacceptable to Russia. That is, Europeans claiming they will put troops on the ground in Ukraine, and President Trump hinting he might authorize a no-fly zone approach to Ukraine, patrolling it from the air with American aircraft, none of which has any chance at all of being accepted by the Russians. This is exactly why they went to war. They're not going to give up their objective of eliminating the menace that they perceive from Ukraine. The very interesting thing to me is security guarantees don't have to be directly military. Look at the example of the Austrian State Treaty of 1955. In that treaty, Austria, which had been occupied by the Soviet Union, the United States, Britain, and France, was given a status as an independent neutral state. The treaty itself doesn't refer to neutrality, but those who guaranteed the independence and neutrality of Austria knew exactly what they were doing. That treaty guaranteed minority rights within Austria, so that Slovenes, Hungarians, Italians, and others who desired cultural and linguistic autonomy, similar to that in Quebec, Canada, got a guarantee of that. It's worked very well.
And going by what happened in Yugoslavia later, one could argue that that was a pretty successful one.
It was. You could say, you can cite other examples. Switzerland, 1820. European powers agreed on the independence and neutrality of Switzerland, and that has lasted very successfully. Switzerland now seems to be sliding into a bit of alignment with NATO, but still, that lasted. I think in the 1880s, Belgian neutrality and independence was recognized by the relevant powers as a buffer state. So there are examples of guarantees backed by the possibility of the use of force, but not involving military deployments. There are no foreign troops in Austria. There are no foreign troops in Switzerland. There were no foreign troops in Belgium. And so why is this discussion of security guarantees failing to address the underlying questions, which are, how can you prevent the Russians from perceiving a threat from Ukraine and from the West? How can you prevent the West from perceiving a threat from Russia? Both sides have exaggerated fears, obviously. The Russians have shown they're prepared to go to war over those fears. The Europeans have shown not that they will go to war, but that they're prepared to fight to the last Ukrainian in their own interest to weaken and isolate Russia. That hasn't worked. We are almost down to the last Ukrainian as we speak. The front is crumbling. The Ukraine does not have the manpower to continue this war. There was recently an alleged hack of the Ukrainian Defense Ministry, which revealed documents which appear to be genuine. I mean, when I first saw them, I thought, this is hard to believe, but they document a combination of killed in action, missing in action, defection, desertion of 1.7 million Ukrainians in the last three and a half years. This corroborates what most military experts who've examined the issue, free of Western propaganda, Ukrainian propaganda, relayed and amplified by the West, that the Ukrainian losses have greatly outnumbered and those on the Russian side. The Russians have been quite cautious in the way they've advanced, which is why it hasn't been a blitzkrieg. It's been slow. Phrases like unprovoked aggression, full-scale invasion, and so on are propaganda. It looks as though we are beginning to see some of the true contours of that struggle, and they are very, very ugly. And anyone who does care about Ukraine should want to endorse the 69% of Ukrainians who now favor a negotiated end to the war. The majority, a large majority, don't want to continue this war. We may have a false impression of them because their performance on the battlefield has been heroic. Ukrainians have shown themselves to be brave and innovative and skilled at warfare, but it's not enough. And this needs to come to an end. And I think President Trump, to his credit, does recognize that, and he sees it as an opportunity. His problem is that he's surrounded by incompetent people who who amplify his own incompetence rather than correct it, and who tell him what he wants to hear. And when they do tell him something he doesn't want to hear, he fires them or gives them the cold shoulder. So we see that the head of the Defense Intelligence Agency has just been fired for reporting that the attack on Iran did not obliterate the Iranian nuclear program. No way to run a government, in my
earlier, one of the chiefs of the Labor Bureau was fired when some of these labor market data came out.
And then also you can say, basically, Tulsi Gabbard, when she gave a wrong, politically incorrect answer to a question, has been given the cold shoulder. And you now see her doing all kinds of outlandish things to re-ingratiate herself with the great man in the White House.